Survivor is a very special, meeting a survivor is a very special and a very unique experience. Not only because to learn, but because today we don't have that many survivors left with us. So every one of you sitting here today listening to a survivor is not only an opportunity to learn, but a responsibility to then share his story. Because as we already see, it's not so distant, but people already start questioning did things ever happen. And we have to hear the stories and tell the stories. But more than that, we also have to learn from survivors' resiliency, being proud, and how they carried through. Most of the survivors that we have today were younger during the war. And it's a very unique perspective how they dealt with this as well. So tonight we're honored to have with us Dr. Gingold, who's going to share with us his story. But before I introduce him, I do want to share with everybody here in our room how special it is to have you, because we at Illini Chabad, and special to have Mommy on the secret. So we are about to launch at Chabad a program called Stories That Live. Stories That Live is being launched here and on 7 of our sister Chabad campuses, Madison and WashU and UPenn, Michigan, and 3 colleges in Philadelphia. And the idea is there are going to be 10 students, 10 fellows, under the leadership of Ellie Scott, who's leading this project, where you can apply, you'll be interviewed, and 10 fellows are going to be paired up with a survivor. And from now until, not from now, next semester maybe, the entire semester, you'll meet with the survivor weekly. And then at the end of the semester, you'll share their story. This year, we're starting with 10. Hopefully next year, we'll go up to 20, 30, 40, 50, as many students as we can to become a mouthpiece and share their story. So for more information, Ellie's right over here. I know many people have already applied, but speak to Ellie about it. Or you can go on storiesthatlive.com. Storiesthatlive.com. It's for students at the University of Illinois. Following today's talk, we'll also have appetizers. Dr. Gingold will be around. You can speak to him in person. And we also have a bite, an Israeli appetizer that will be served in the center room. I want to introduce a good friend. 19 years ago when I moved here, I met the Gingolds. And I know initially, for many years, I've been asking Dr. Gingold if he'd be willing to share his story. And for many years, he told me no. And I feel that it's a real blessing that now he is sharing the story. And you want to call Dr. Gingold up to the microphone, and let's give him a warm welcome to Chabad. We'll have questions and answers at the end. Always 5 minutes. I'm good. I'm good. Thanks. Looking at the little girl with that. And, she had her pajamas on, and that's about the time for me. So anyway, I move around quite a bit, so I don't know if this mic will be okay for me. I can take it off the stand. If I move around, will you still be able to hear me back there? Okay. Do you want me to take the mic off the stand? Is that easier for you? Okay, well, I'll get confused as an old guy holding a clicker and a microphone. I don't know which is which. So anyway, my name is Bill Gingold. What I like to do is share with you some snippets about the Gingold family in terms of their experiences to try to survive during a very difficult time, which we refer to sometimes as a Holocaust. And we were extremely fortunate that most of our immediate family survived. And it was pretty much due to the luck and grittiness, and I think probably advanced planning for us to survive. So I will go through a number of slides with you. I won't show you all of them,
I try not to perseverate on the nasty stuff. So I'll try to accentuate the positive as much as I can in my presentation here. Okay. I'll stay on the side here so I don't interfere with too much in terms. Can you see that on that screen all the way up there? I'll try to cover some of those points here in terms of the Gingolds. All of the Gingolds in this presentation were all born in Warsaw, Poland. Warsaw, Poland was and is still the capital of Poland. At the time of the Second World War or preceding it, Warsaw was a very cultural-oriented city. It was one of the dominant cultural centers in Europe. So that it was very sophisticated in many, many ways until the war occurred. I'll also tell you a little bit about the invasion of Warsaw and some of the things that happened or didn't happen. But I'll spend most of the time talking about the Gingolds, particularly my mother and dad and my older brother, Sam. So I'll introduce you to some of the characters in this plot, and we'll move along. And I never repeat the same presentation because being an old guy, I don't remember what I said before. So we'll go ahead here and see if this clicker clicks. There we go. I'd like to introduce you to my parents who have passed away. Leah was my mother, and David or Dubit was my dad. She was about 5'2" in height, and he was about 6'2" in height. As you can, I'll talk about them a little bit. They're kind of the reason that I'm here, not only because of birth, but of survival. Just a few points that I just want to, I don't want to stress here, but there are some characteristics of Jewish people that permeate everything that I talk about, and those are just very briefly listed on top. And this won't be a session on anti-Semitism or extermination in terms of genocide. It'll be about the Gingolds and some of the things that they went through to survive. In terms of the Holocaust, one of the things I think all of you should be aware of is that many factors get into having such a situation. But the dominant one are all of the things that feed into a thing that we call hate. And hate is very difficult to stop. It seems to start pretty quickly. And when hate gets so intense, it generally leads to some kind of physical aggression, violence, murder, and so on. So whenever we can kind of look at the different behaviors that feed into and enhance the factor of hate, and we can reduce those, we'll be making progress. And again, I don't want to get into a lecture here with you on this. So I'll skip a few slides, okay? Just a little bit about Warsaw. The population of Warsaw was about 1.2, 1.3 million people at that time. And about a third of the population of Warsaw were Jewish people. So about 350,000 to 400,000 Jews occupied Warsaw before the war. And, and as I indicated to you, Warsaw was a very active cultural, religious, and well-to-do economic environment. Unfortunately, even though 1/3 of the population in Warsaw were people of Jewish, they were not assimilated by the rest of the people in Warsaw. So in many respects, they lived in kind of segmented sections of Warsaw without being assimilated. The war begins September 1, 1939. The siege of Warsaw is 1 week later. And Baruch, Bill Gingold, was born September 20th, 1939. One day after delivery, the hospital that my mother was in was bombed. Now, the reason that we didn't get kind of destroyed on the bombing was the fact that my dad anticipated something strange to be happening in Warsaw, like many other Jewish people were anticipating. And as soon as he heard that my mom gave birth, he came to the hospital to remove us and get the heck out of there. As you can see, Warsaw as well as Poland surrendered just a few weeks later. So the Polish military were still trying to fight the Germans and their tanks with horses. So it didn't last very long, unfortunately. This is a ward, a maternity ward in the hospital. I was very fortunate enough to have some of these pictures that were taken, and I can't validate the exact status of this maternity ward, whether it was in the hospital that I was born, but it gives you an idea anyway. High tech. As you know, as things are happening in Ukraine, when Russia bombs the hell out of the buildings, people get into the basement as quickly as possible. This was the same scenario in terms of Warsaw, where people, whenever the bombing started, everybody moved to the basement, including people in the hospital. And that's what a picture looked like. This is what the hospital looked like after it was bombed. Not much left of it. Okay, let me get more into the Gingold family here. I want to introduce you to a few people. I apologize if I'm in the way here. My dad's name again was David or David. Leah was my mother. And I was very fortunate to have some other family members at that time that were very much in touch and very close with my parents. And that's a young woman by the name of Hava. She was my aunt. She was about 16, 17 years of age at that time. A little younger than most of you. Then my uncle Froyen, who was about 21 years of age at that time, and my older brother Sam, who was about 7 years older than I was. Those are the main characters that I'll be talking about this evening. So anyway, I kind of gave you a sense. My dad was kind of anticipating some crazy things happening as a result of the Germans moving into Poland. And so he was kind of anticipating that once he was able to get my mom and me out of the hospital, that we and thousands upon thousands of other people would try to move to the east towards the Russian sector of Poland. So that was one of the first initial attempts to get the heck out of Warsaw to try to survive. And through a long process, without getting into very many details, we reached, but before we reached the Russian encampments, thousands of people would be streaming out of Warsaw, going towards the Russian front. And as they were streaming out on the roads, German fighter planes would swoop over them and machine gun the people. And the ones that were able to dive into the gullies and on the side of the road or get into the forest were the lucky ones. But this was a huge attempt by thousands of people to get out of Warsaw, Poland. We were fortunate is that we survived that event. And we reached the Russian encampments, and lo and behold, the Russian soldiers would put us on trucks. Unfortunately, they were German trucks. And the reason for that was at that point in time, there was a non-aggression treaty between Germany and Russia. And the non-aggression treaty was basically, we won't attack each other. So we wound up being shipped back to Warsaw in trucks. Okay, and when we were shipped back to Warsaw, we were moved into an area which eventually became the Warsaw Ghetto. So when we were moved back to what was to be the Warsaw Ghetto in a relatively short time, I just made some notes here for me mostly. We were provided with one room, had no heat, no light, no furniture, and we had to share a kitchen and a bathroom with others in these dilapidated buildings. There was a food line at that time, but I'll share the nutritional aspects a little later with you. Here I was 1 week old, and at this point in time, just a few weeks later, the Nazis started to pick up people for slave labor. What they would do is basically get adults and older children, usually 14, 15 years of age and older, that looked like they had some physical stamina and weren't listening to the old guy talking about Warsaw Ghetto. I'm just kidding with you. Yes. And what happened is that the people that were in that condition, in other words, they were still capable of working as perceived by the Nazis. They would be picked up early in the morning and taken out of this soon to be the ghetto and taken to different manufacturing areas for the German war effort. And these people became slave laborers. The fortunate part was they received a little more of the nutritional support than the people that were living the ghetto spaces. So anyway, one of the things that happened is during this initial phase is that Polish nurses would come into this ghetto space and usually visit with parents of their young children. And some of these nurses were not so much interested in the health and well-being of the people in the spaces. They were more interested to try to save the babies and the young children. So what they would do is say, do you want to give up your baby? We'll try to save it, because they were anticipating as to what was going to happen to people that were in this congregate space. So one of the things that they would do is ask the parents of their young children, do you want to give up your baby or your young child? We'll try to get it adopted with a Christian family, or we would try to get them out of the geographic area, maybe to another sector in Europe, to try to save the child. And that was a very difficult decision for any parent, whether they were Jewish or not, to give up your baby in the effort to either save it or not save it. My mother decided she wasn't going to give me up. I was so cute at that time. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So anyway, here we were. And one of the things that I have to stress to you at this point in time is that one of the things that, by and large, the Jewish people, their focus is always, how can I enhance the growth and development of my child, because the future is so important for us. So what happened is other people had problems just like the Gingolds had in terms of survival. But when they saw that my mother had an infant, other people that maybe had older kids would donate their clothes to my mother, so the clothes could be ripped up and used as diapers. You know, we didn't have a pamper system at that time, unfortunately. Anyway, the effort was always, what can I do to keep my child alive for the future? The ghetto was established very shortly after the Nazis occupied Warsaw. And let me explain what the ghetto was. Okay. If you look at the big square here, I think it's a square, isn't it? Yeah, it's close enough. Okay. That's kind of the size of Warsaw. If you look at the little square in the upper right-hand corner, that was the Warsaw Ghetto. That was the size of, and the sizes are proportionate here. It's about 2.54% of the total geographic space of Warsaw was on the little square. But it had 30% of the population and compacted in that 2.5% of that space. So people lived in a very crowded environment. On the average, it was between 8 and 10 people to a room. I described the room to you before, so I won't go into that. Interestingly enough, in the early part of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were quite a few gates open between the ghetto space and the external environment. And as a result of that, which was allowed by the German military, the Polish people would come into the ghetto and help set up markets, open markets, and negotiate things with the Jewish people that lived in there. Shortly after that, or just a few months later, after that picture of the open market, the ghetto was started to be walled off. It started to have an enclosure all the way around the ghetto. And the enclosure was basically a brick wall, about 10, 11 feet high, with barbed wire and with shards of glass on top, which would suggest they didn't want people to leave. All of the labor to put this wall together were done by the Jewish people living inside the ghetto. And this is just a brief description and explaining. Now, one of the critical aspects was survival in the ghetto. And just to give you a sense of the dire situation there, between 7,000 and 9,000 people a day died. And most of them as a result of starvation, followed by disease. Just for your information, if you look at the caloric intake, today, when we talk about how many calories you should consume each day, if you're not a crazy, McDonald's hamburger person, that's usually between 2,000 and 2,500 calories a day, which would be the normal adult range of intake. If you look at, I don't think the counter works. The Germans were doing very well. They exceeded the 2,500 calories a day in terms of nutritional intake. The Polish people weren't doing quite as well as the Germans. These are the Polish people outside the ghetto. They were about 1/4 of the intake of the German people, or normal intake. And as you can see, the Jewish people were about 1/10. That would suggest to you the starvation level that was occurring in the ghetto. And then, of course, all kinds of diseases. There's a whole listing of things here. And the medical care was almost non-existent. The only medical care that was provided was by some of these Polish nurses that came in and some of the Jewish physicians. But the problem is they had the same problem as other Jewish people, aside from trying to deal with their professional practices. So there wasn't much of the healthcare or medicine, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, there was also, some brutality attached to some of the relationships between the German soldiers and the residents inside the ghetto. I'm trying to use nice terms for you, okay? This is just a picture that I was able to get from, I think it was either the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. or Yad Vashem. That kind of gives you kind of a sense of the starvation, because almost all of these individuals are victims. Here is a picture of a teenager, actually, that looks like a very young child who has passed due to starvation. Now, there were quite a few Jewish efforts to maintain and try to enhance survival in the ghetto. And those were some of the activities, but most of them were very short-lived because the Nazi regime wouldn't allow them. Well, keep in mind one question: how do I have all of this information? I was a baby. So that's one of the questions you should ask me later on, okay? Okay, I mentioned to you my brother Sam. He wasn't old enough to be. He wasn't old enough to be picked up for slave labor. So youngsters that were basically under the age of about 14, 15, or when they looked older, they were also picked up. But anyway, they were put in roles to keep the ghetto somewhat clean, if you will, from dead people. So when people died inside the ghetto, what would usually happen in terms of procedures is if they died indoors, all of their clothes would be removed. And the reason for that was to save the clothes for other people to be used. And they would take the dead person outside, put him by the side of the buildings or in the streets. And these corpse collectors, which my brother was one of them, would pick up those bodies, put them in carts, and those carts would be moved out of the ghetto. What do you think happened to those bodies once they were moved out of the ghetto? They were either buried in mass graves or they were incinerated. Remember, I mentioned to you between 7,000 and 9,000 people died every day. Anyway, the nurses kept them coming, and my mother had a second opportunity to unload me, and she didn't take that opportunity either. And during this whole process, it became evident, at least to my parents, particularly my dad. I always describe my dad as a hyperactive adult who was always in motion, very foresighted, could think ahead, try to anticipate what was happening. And I think he had some good leadership skills, unbiased, of course. Anyway, so he was one of the leaders in a certain section of the ghetto in a variety of ways. And based on the desperation of the people there, he and others tried to organize different ways and thinking on how to escape the Warsaw Ghetto. So one of the first efforts to try to get out of the ghetto was to go through the sewers of Warsaw. So through the coordination of my dad and some other leadership people, they were able to cluster a number of families. Now, one of the things I should mention to you is that none of the leadership people, including my dad, would ever talk about anything that they were doing at night with family members. And the reason was pretty simple. If they got caught and the Germans knew who the family was, the treatment that the people that were caught would get carried over to the family members. And most of it was they would get killed. So my dad never talked with my mother about any of this in terms of any planning, etc. And that was true with other family members and family members that represented family members. Well, anyway, multiple families tried to coordinate their efforts through the tunnel. Unfortunately, someone forgot to put the sewer cover on straight, and basically the Nazi patrols noticed that, and as soon as they noticed that, they started machine gunning into the sewers. The whole idea was to kill anybody that was in there. Again, a lot of people were very fortunate. They didn't get killed, including the Gingolds, and they were able to get back into the lofty apartments. Being facetious, okay? As part of the ongoing desire to escape the ghetto, one of the major undertakings by many, many people and many smaller groups in secret was to build tunnels. The tunnels were built initially between buildings so they could communicate with each other. But the real goal of these tunnels was to build under the wall, to tunnel under the wall to the outside. And this is just an example of a young fellow, adult, doing the tunneling, because that was one way to do smuggling of goods and food between the people inside and the Polish resistance people on the outside that were willing to take the risk to deal with the Jewish people. And my brother and my dad were involved in that task as well, how to do tunnels. And my brother wound up being a smuggler who was able to crawl through the tunnels to reach the Polish resistance people that were willing to make exchanges of food for other things. I want to show you this picture here. This is a diagram of the Warsaw Ghetto in yellow and the cemeteries in green. Well, the reason I'm showing you this is one of the major tunneling efforts was to tunnel under the wall of the ghetto to reach the tombstones of the cemetery. And the reason for that is that that was one of the few areas that were not patrolled by the Nazis. So that was quasi-safe spot to do transactions between the people inside the ghetto and the Polish people on the outside of the ghetto. And the transactions were pretty much trying to bring food in and exchange whatever the people had inside, whether it was clothes or jewelry or whatever, exchange. So keep that in mind, because that was one of the thoughts that my dad had and others, is let's use these tunnels going to the cemeteries that aren't terribly guarded, as well as the rest of the place. So, using that thinking, the Gingolds and others started using those tunnels that were out to the cemeteries, not only to exchange goods between the Polish people and the Jewish people inside the ghetto for food and so on, but also maybe as a way to escape the ghetto. So that's what my dad and other kind of leadership folks were involved. And they basically took a chance of doing that and trying to escape through these tunnels into the cemetery and get out of the area. And as they were able to do that, they dispersed once they went out into the cemeteries. So different families went in different directions, and my parents and some others took the route of trying to reach the Russian front, going east towards towards Russia. This is just a picture, it's out of place, but that's what the Warsaw Ghetto looked like after it was totally bombed. Oh, I have forgot to really show you the main characters. Ava, I told you, was a teenager, about 16, 17. She was my mother's sister, and Freund was my mother's brother. He was about 21, and Duvet, the tough-looking guy, was my dad, and he looks tough. You didn't kid around with him at all. At any age, come to think of it. But anyway, those were the ones that tried to keep the Gingolds alive. We traveled from farm to farm at night, and my uncle, Freund, was kind of the scout. He was sent out ahead because he was young, he was still strong. And the reason was that we never knew which farmers would help and which farmers would not help, and even try to keep you for the Germans to take you back. So my uncle was a critical, pivotal role in kind of preventing potential problems. So anyway, some farmers were willing to help, others were not willing to help. And some were very close calls in terms of where the farmers would try to keep us on the farm until the Germans came so they could turn us over to the Germans. Other farmers were just opposite. They would do everything they could to help you. So it was kind of potluck. And sometimes the people that really turned out to be real help to the Jewish people, we sometimes refer to them as the righteous. And there are very few of them left, just like Holocaust survivors, unfortunately. Just as a point of information, I was kind of curious personally about the righteous. And one of the things that they seem to have some common characteristics. This is not the place to discuss them, but the more of those that you have, the better the world is. That's all I can say at this juncture. For nearly a month, we continued the journey from farm to farm to try to reach the Russian military encampments. And at this point in time, Russia and Germany were at war. They broke the non-aggression pact, which was good for us. Once we reached the Russian encampments, we were again loaded on trucks. This time, they were Russian trucks rather than German trucks. So as part of that, these trucks transported us to trains. I'll show you some pictures of that very shortly. And these trains took us to a wonderful vacation resort area called Siberia. At this point in time, during the transfer between trucks and trains, we were separated from my aunt and uncle. So we didn't know where they went. But we did find out after the war where they went. I'll tell you. Here is an example of one of those trains heading towards Siberia. And I was about 3 years of age, and this was the first time I recall anything of our adventures. It was the first recall. And what I recall were really two things. One was when we get out of these box cars, all the snow, just white snow all over the place. And being a 3-year-old boy, you have a hell of a good time playing in the snow. But unfortunately, it was very cold, so you did it very quickly. But it was a kid's experience. The other thing that I noticed, let me just take a drink. I died there. Well, that I noticed was the Russian soldiers also had rifles, just like the German soldiers did. But what I noticed, which is ironic for a 3-year-old, is that the Russian rifles always pointed towards the ground, and the German rifles always pointed against people. That was the only difference that I noticed. Well, anyway, the train ride was very long. Here's an example of a boxcar, very similar to boxcars the Nazis used to transport the Jews to killing camps. Except here they had food inside. They had straw, blankets to keep warm, etc. So it was a different treatment than the Nazi boxcars. This is inside one of those boxcars. So we were transported, took quite a while, to one of the lumber camps in northern Siberia. And this is just a picture. I don't know if it's the one that we were at or not. I don't know how to explain it. And the adults, the camps, they all work from early morning until between dark. And that included my mom and dad. And interestingly enough, the older kids had to wind up taking care of the younger kids because all adults that could work worked in the lumber mills. This is just a sketch, just to give you a sense. We were in a barracks, like with many other. There were four families to each barracks, and the spaces were divided by sheets, so you had visual privacy, at least a little bit, with the stove, the heating unit right in the middle between the four units usually. This is just a sketch, just to show you. Snow drifts were anywhere from 12 to 16 feet high. The average temperature was below freezing 11 months out of the year. You had only 1 month that were averaged above freezing. So it wasn't a very comfortable environment outside for anyone. The kids very seldom left the indoors. No one wanted to escape the lumber camps, and the reason was very simple. One, there was nowhere to escape to, even though it was guarded. The other thing was the people that had weapons were not there to use them on people. They were there to protect the people that were at the lumber camps from the bears that were all around them. So even if you tried to leave the camp, you would get mauled by the bears. Okay. So there was no incentive for anyone to try to run away, is what I'm telling you. Okay. And I've just shared that information with you. They work 7 days a week. My older brother became the sitter and teacher for me. And I have to, that was another one of my initial recollections as a little kid, is that he would take sawdust and put it on the floor, and with sticks, he would try to teach me different figures, configurations, it might be numbers, letters, words, etc. So that was kind of the initial etch and sketch, if you will. Okay. And the older kids became the teachers and guardians of the younger kids, because all adults that were able to work were the lumber mills. And I just jotted down a few other things that the kids did to help each other. So they were really instructional units. No formal curriculum, but very effective curriculum. This is a picture of my older brother and me. This is sometime in 1942, I'm not sure exactly when. And as you can see, we're pretty well fed. We look like we're in pretty good shape. And to us, we were kids, we were having a heck of a good time. Yeah. Well, shortly after that, because they didn't keep families very long in these lumber camps, the Russians gave us papers that will allow us to travel through Russia. And just a point I forgot to mention to you, the people that worked in the lumber camps did get paid, not a lot, but they had some resources that they were able to save. So when they were let go to travel through Russia, they had some resources to support themselves. At the same time, both my parents would work on farms as we were traveling as laborers. And just a point of information, neither one of my parents had any formal education. So education to them became a priority. Just to give you a sense, my dad could speak 5 languages, and my mom could speak 4. But they were all languages of survival. They couldn't write or read any of them, but they could speak them. Anyway, as we traveled through Russia, for some reason, whether it was rumor mill or otherwise, people said you should go to Kazakhstan. So we wound up going to Kazakhstan, and my mother wound up working on the outdoor market, while my dad wound up working in a military factory. And my mom became very good at trading, even though she couldn't read or write. Interestingly enough, a few months later, after we were there almost a year, my dad was picked up by the police and arrested. And he was sent to a prison that we didn't know where he was. So my mom had to deal with 2 kids on her own in a very strange land and do the best she could. But interestingly enough, about 6 months later, my dad shows up. He found us where we were still in Kazakhstan. And, it was always interesting to ask him, how come they let you out of prison? And he said, they didn't know what to do with me because they didn't have any records of any kind as to why I should be there. And they needed more space. That's why they let me go. Thank goodness they did. Okay. Hitler dies in 1945. Germany surrenders. We receive legal Russian papers, which allows us to go to Poland and try to search for any family members that still survive. Unfortunately, the search proves to be futile. No one of our family members wound up surviving. And as the rumor mill occurred, is that and throughout all of our travels, there were always rumors of all kinds. And one of the rumor mills was, if you could somehow reach Berlin, particularly the American sector, there would be some social service agencies there that might be able to help the displaced persons. So the goal for the Gingolds was to reach Berlin. And all kinds of trials and tribulations occurred throughout their travel to try to reach Berlin. And another one of my memories that I still have is that when we were trying to reach Berlin, my brother and I, we would basically look for things that would be usable, whether it was clothes or other stuff and food. One of the things that we did is we would go garbage dump hunting. We would get into garbage dumps, garbage trucks, etc. And one time we had a wonderful experience where we were in this garbage truck sorting stuff that we could take with us, and the truck started moving. So we were fortunate enough to be able to get the heck out of the truck. Okay. But anyway, it's kind of, when I think about it and I remember that, what fun it was. So we continued our trek to Berlin, and this was a tough trek. It was over quite a few months. So, but anyway, once we reached Berlin, my mom was able to find a job in a bakery, and my dad in a brick factory. But we stayed in Berlin a relatively short time. Now, this is a picture of my older brother and me in Berlin. So we were in pretty good shape. Everything is relative. This was in about 1946. Anyway, we were in Berlin at a relatively short period of time, and we were transferred to DP camp, displaced persons camp. So Berlin was kind of a clearing point where people would come and then they would kind of parcel them out or ship them out to other places for the living quarters until something definite could be figured out. And we were sent to a place called Fehrenwald. Fehrenwald was a displaced persons camp. It was one of the larger ones. At one time, it had a maximum population of about 5,000 in this camp. And I think there were probably almost 24 DP camps throughout Germany and a couple in Poland, not too many, most of them in Germany. This camp was about 30 kilometers or about 18 to 20 miles from Munich, Germany. A year after we were in camp, lo and behold, it was a very productive camp. During 1 year after the war, 250 babies were born at that camp. Okay, very productive camp. And my young brother Jacob was born at that time. Okay, he was one of the 250. And my older brother Sam got his bar mitzvah at Camp Fehrenwald. And this is just a map. Fehrenwald is right about here. Here's Munich. Very close. One of the things that the camps almost immediately did, even though the camps were under the auspices of the American military, almost all camps and the residents, which were probably in most cases Jewish, like maybe 95% eventually, they would organize their own system of schooling, government, social events, recreation, athletics, etc. So all of the camps tried to do that. And one of the vehicles that they immediately established is that they put together newspapers. Almost every camp had a newspaper. And that was a way of communication between the camps. They would share these papers between the camps so people would know what Camp Fehrenwald is doing compared to another camp. Oh, this is a layout of Camp Fehrenwald, and the reason I'm showing that to you, this was under American auspices. It had a fence around it, but it didn't make any difference. People could leave the place without checking the them. And most people that live close to the fence would dig under the fence so they could save time and not have to walk to the gate. Okay, but that was no big deal. But the reason I'm showing this to you is if you look at the name of the streets, they're all American states. And ironically, the Gingolds live at 14 Illinois Street in Fairmont. Okay. Wow. Well planned, huh? All right. This is just a picture of Fairmont. A lot of activities in terms of kids. This was one of the common things that the newspapers that shared with other camps would do, is put pictures of kids and their names, and these were kids that were orphans, at least on the surface. And what was they're trying to do through this communication loop was to see if any relatives or family members recognize these kids in terms of being their own or had some knowledge about them, etc. So it was one way to find other relatives. On May 24th, this is kind of an indication that I was leaving the camp. This is just a picture of about half a year ago. Before that, anticipating that we would leave the camp somewhere for someplace. This is the actual boat that the Gingolds were on. It was a military transport, and the picture on the bottom kind of indicates how the sleeping quarters were in that boat. Kind of a 5-6 vertical there. Okay, so if you had to go to the bathroom and you were on top, you were in trouble. Or the other people were in trouble, one of the two. Okay. This is a manifest, and the Gingolds are listed right down here. This is a great hall on Ellis Island, where the ships kind of arrived with immigrants and displaced persons. And again, this is one place that I remember, because one being a little kid, it was kind of fun running around in a big hall, bumping into a lot of people. The other thing that I remember is that we were large groups of people were taken out of this great hall and moved to smaller rooms that were just bare. And as we stood there, all kinds of powder came down on us, and that was a way to delouse the immigrants. So for the kids, it was fun. Oh, it's snowing indoors. Okay, but anyway, it was a delousing procedure. These are the Gingolds that wound up going to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, one of the things that happened in Berlin, just to mention to you, is that because of the rumor mills, the social service agencies and the naturalization, immigration departments would ask you, where do you want to go? And the most frequent names were United States, Israel, and Argentina. So my parents didn't have the foggiest idea about any of those places. So their thought was, well, the last rumor that we heard is United States might be the best place. So that's how we wound up coming to the United States. Strictly just random, I would suspect, which was fortunate. And the way we wound up going to Milwaukee, I mentioned to you that both of my parents were unskilled laborers. And at that time, Milwaukee was a high-powered manufacturing city and had a lot of needs for unskilled labor. So these agencies kind of recommended as to where we should go. And that's where we wound up going, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my dad wound up working at a steel mill in Inland Steel for all of his life. And my mom wound up working in a bakery all of her working life. This is Bill Gingold when he was about 12, maybe 12. Milwaukee was a chilly place in the winter. I have to share this with you. We came to the United States during the summer. And neither my brother or I ever went to school. So the social service agencies that helped us in the location process were able to get us a tutor during the summer. And the tutor would spend maybe 1 or 2 hours a week with each of us. My brother gave up on it totally. He was not interested. He was a young, teenager. He was not interested. He wanted to go to work and find a job. So I decided to stick with it a little bit. But anyway, because the tutoring was only once or twice a week, one of the things I was trying to do is how do you keep yourself occupied? You don't know English, and you're in a foreign country. So one of the things that my mother did, she would prepare a lunch for me, a sandwich or whatever. And they would give me a little bit of money to use the bus system in Milwaukee. And so I figured out that the movie theaters were in downtown Milwaukee. And I could take a lunch with me. And I don't know how much the bus ticket was cost, maybe 5 cents at that time. And go to the movies when I was not being tutored. And the movies would usually start like 11 o'clock in the morning and would keep on repeating until maybe midnight. They stopped. So I would sit in the theater for 5, 6 hours at a time watching American movies. And most of the movies that I was watching were cowboy movies. Okay, and the reason I'm showing you this is, again, you never know what the future holds. For you young folks, because you probably don't recognize any of these people. This is Gene Autry up here. Roy Rogers, Gail Evans, Cisco Kid. You're going to get a test on this after this. With Poncho. And I don't remember these two, but this guy was Hopalong Cassidy. And his stage name was William Boyd. And so these were most of the movies that I kept on seeing all the time and picking up English a little bit at a time. And one thing that happened is when I turned 18, I applied to be a naturalized United States citizen. So I appeared in front of a judge, and he couldn't pronounce the word Baruch. So he said, "Do you want an English American name?" And lo and behold, the king of the cowboys at that time was William Boyd, Hopalong Cassidy. So I said, William would be great. And that's how I got my name. Okay, that's a heck of a note, huh? Okay. The other part of my English learning experience, the Gingolds resided in the ghetto of Milwaukee. We were one of the few Caucasian families in an all-black environment. And we lived next to a church that had a thrift store in it. And the Gingolds shopped at the thrift store all the time. And one of the things that one of the salespeople noticed that I was at the thrift store a lot, looking at comic books all the time. So she said, "Just take him." So I wound up carrying a lot of comic books home, and that became my reading material for English. Remember, it has those little bubbles on top that you can, read. And it was also kind of interesting. One time I gave a little presentation. I talked in public schools usually, and one of the kids asked me, "Do you still have some of those comic books?" I wish I did. Those are my parents in the 70s. My dad lived until he was about 76. He still looks mean here. And my mom lived until she was 95. She was a tough cookie. Fellows, just to let you know, women are much tougher than men. And the sooner you admit that, the better off you'll be. Now, let me share with you why I know all of this information. A book was written by my nephew. His name is Jeffrey Gingold, and that's the name of the book. And it's mostly about my older brother, actually, even though it talks about a lot of things. And one of the things that Jeffrey did is he researched the Gingolds for about 6 years, where he not only interviewed my mother and my older brother before they passed for quite a few years, but he also went to other primary sources in Poland and in Germany to collect the information. So the book that he wrote about my brother and the rest of the Gingolds are about as documented as you can be, based on all of the dynamics that have occurred in terms of the war and after the war, etc. So at this point in time, I appreciate that you allowed me to ramble a bit here, a little bit, and I'd be glad to try to answer questions for you if I can.
I'm wondering how or why your father was arrested. What was the reason?
Okay, well, he never really talked about it per se, but the best we can make out is one, he worked at a military factory that made shoes and clothing. My mom was a person that had a spot on the market selling stuff, We were one of the few Jewish people there. I think there was the assumption that he stole something from the factory that my mother sold. That's the best we can make of it.
Somebody asked in Zoom, who sponsored you to go to Milwaukee?
Let's see. The Jewish Vocational Services was one of the sponsors. I don't recall the others. Yes.
What happened to your aunt and uncle?
Oh, okay, good question. We were separated basically when we were transferred to the train to go to Siberia at that time. After we got settled into Milwaukee, we did some searching. And interestingly enough, both my aunt and uncle wound up being in Israel. And part of my nephew's research in the book was to go to Israel and meet all of the family members, the kids of my aunt and uncle. But all of the immediate Gingolds are all dead except me. Yes.
Did your mother ever give you a reason as to why she kept you in the
Yeah, like most parents, they feel they can do a better job than anybody else. But I think we were also very tightly knit. And I don't think my dad was interested in letting us separate, I would guess. Now, just to let you know, my parents never talked about these kinds of things with me or my brother, even though my brother was firsthand knowledge of some of the stuff. The way we learned a lot of it was by reading my nephew's book. He wouldn't share his book with us before it was published. And so I learned a lot of stuff about my parents that I didn't know about. He recorded audio and video tapes interviewing my mother and my brother for quite a few years, and I have all of those. So that's the way it is. Other questions?
Your father never talked about it?
No. Neither did my mother.
Not to you.
No. Let me just share with you a little tidbit that I learned from the book, which may be kind of funny actually. One of the things, I used to take my mom out for lunch when I was some other than adult. And one of the things I noticed was that she always either had a handkerchief or would take a napkin. And when we finished eating, she would take things like crackers, jelly pads, sugar cubes, and put them in the handkerchief or paper towels or whatever she might have. And she would stick it in her purse. She wouldn't say anything about it. And I was too embarrassed to ask, what the hell are you doing? Anyway, next time I saw her, I didn't see her that often. I was on my own pretty much. She would have that handkerchief with those goodies that she picked up in the restaurant and give it to me as a present. And I was too embarrassed to ask, why are you giving me this? I really don't need it. Well, I learned why by reading my nephew's book. When I was a baby, remember, food was a problem issue. And what she would do when my aunt, uncle, and my dad would come from their slave labor, they would have some extra rations that they would save. And they would give it to my mother. And most of the rations were breadcrumbs, nothing of significance, but she would put them in this handkerchief and save it. And then there might be lumps of sugar, etc. So she always saved that. And one of the things that happened as we were escaping, going through from farm to reach the Russian border. Remember, I was a little kid. I don't know when to keep quiet. Just like little kids. They express themselves when they need to express themselves. So when we were at farms hiding, and German patrols would come close to the farms and get relatively close to maybe the barns that we were staying in order for me not to make noise, she would take that handkerchief with a sugar lump and stick it in my mouth. And that's why I still love sweets. Just love it. Okay, so there was a madness behind this that I was totally unaware of. So, you just learn some of that stuff, even at my age, which is tough. So, other questions? Yes.
So, from the time you were 18 and you went on through school, are there any particular things you remember that maybe the fact that you were an immigrant, that English wasn't your first language, that from 18 till now? I mean,
Okay, well,
how did school go? Or,
let me jump back maybe a little earlier, if I may. I hope I'm not boring some of you. As I told you, we lived in a very poor area of Milwaukee, one of the few Caucasian counties. And when I started school, I had no school record. I never went to school during all of this time. And so the first thing they tried to do was to test me. I don't know if any of you are in the field of education. It's my expression of that. So the testing, unfortunately, I didn't understand the tester, what the instructions were or what I was supposed to do. So I didn't do too well on these achievement tests or whatever they gave me. So at that point in time, because I didn't do well at all, they referred me to special education, to a class for the mentally retarded. And I was very fortunate that I had a perceptive future principal that said, no, let's try a different approach where maybe test him so he can understand what you're asking him. So I did a little better on the retest. I didn't go into special ed. But anyway, the school that I went to was mostly African-American, Black kids. And so one of the things that I did, I was perceptive enough as part of just survival, is to make friends quickly. And I made friends with two kids, and I remember them so well. One, I'll just tell you the first name, was Ben, and the other one was Kenny. And one was a huge Black kid, and the other one was a squirrely, short Black kid, just hyperactive as it could be, just running everywhere, nothing at the slow speed. Anyway, they became my best friends as we started school in the fall. And they were also my protectorates. because I was in a total foreign environment, not able to speak English, and they were also part of my tutoring system. So when I make some of my expressions, they probably are the ones that I learned from them. Okay. So anyway, without getting into too much detail, when we wound up going to high schools, we got separated, the three of us. Later, when I was going to college, I kind of was curious what happened to them. So I kind of tried to track back for them. Ben, the big kid, wound up going to prison. I don't know for what. Kenny, interestingly enough, wound up going to Marquette University, got a master's degree in engineering, and was in the Olympics as a track star. Here, same three people in the same environment, just different directions. So there are some good things, some not so good things. A lot of it deals with luck, opportunity, etc. Coming back to your question, as I got a little older, I attended a trade school in Milwaukee, because when I finished middle school, the counselor said, well, you're not terribly proficient in English. Maybe you would be better off going to a school where you learn a trade, where you work better with your hands than your brain. And I was the interpreter for parent-teacher conferences for my parents. So I explained that to my parents, and they said, sure, go to trade school. So I went to a place called Boys Tech in Milwaukee. I don't know if any of you are from Milwaukee. But anyway, Boys Tech was pretty much a trade school where you learn plumbing, carpentry, electricity, whatever, in the trades. When I turned to be around 10th grade, I said, well, maybe I don't want to be one of those tradespeople. Maybe I like to get other education. And I was very fortunate in that the principal, I had some great teachers in high school, fantastic teachers, both at Boys Tech. But anyway, as it turned out, the principal and the counselor were able to work with me to get me into another high school. So I wound up attending two high schools almost simultaneously. So in the morning, I went to Boys Tech. In the afternoon, I went to a place called Rufus King, which was a regular academic high school in Milwaukee. And then during the summers, I would attend all summer schools. Good question. So at that point in time, when I graduated high school, it was a long time ago, I had the most high school credits of any high school graduate in Milwaukee because I graduated from two high schools. Very fortunate. What I learned anymore, I have no idea. So anyway, after high school, I was very fortunate enough that I had some scholarships, and I was able to go to the University of Wisconsin and University of Minnesota and UCLA and all of those crazy places. So I was very fortunate. The thing I want to stress to you, at least with the Gingold family, is even though my parents were basically non-educated in terms of academic education, their goal was always be as educated as you can be, learn as much as you can. And the reason for that, the way they looked at it, I think, was you can take people's clothes away, you can take their home, their car, but you can't take their education away. And I think that's been kind of drummed into me. And I guess I kind of express that to any group that I talk about, that education is so important. It allows you to make critical thinking more realistic, etc. So I don't need to lecture you about that stuff. Any other questions?
Right there.
Okay.
We're just gonna take two more questions and then we'll wrap up.
I was just curious what you ended up doing.
I wound up being in family medicine.
Well, we'll take a final question and then after Dr. Gingold will answer questions locally. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much for your fine attention. It was my pleasure.
I want to thank you both. People ask me, does live here now in Champaign, Urbana. And it was our honor when we moved here, your grandkids are at camp and everything. I do want to mention that Dr. Gingold will be around here. He doesn't look, he will be sticking around a little bit. He has to come over, ask any questions. Have a picture with you, if you guys get that.
Oh, sure.
And also meanwhile, in the middle room, we have little appetizers around, like Israeli cigars and other stuff. Nothing like food, that is. And a lot of other appetizers you can have. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Dr. Gingold, for sharing your story. Thank you so much. If you have any questions about stories that live, Ellie is right here. If you want to become a fellow, please speak to Ellie right over here. That was great. Me too. So good to have you. That's awesome. Did you know that?